Welcome back to Chasing Masculinity, the podcast where we explore what it means to live an authentic, purpose-driven life as men in today's world. I'm your host, Colton Wutzke, and today we're diving into a topic that's been on the minds of many young men. Should you start a family young? This is a question that touches on everything from personal responsibility to life goals, and it's one that's often influenced by societal expectations, faith, and the challenges of modern life. Many men wrestle with whether it's the right time to commit to marriage, start building a family, and embrace the responsibilities that come with fatherhood. But what does it really mean to take that step? To help unpack this complex topic, I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Matthew Navarro, someone who has some great personal insights about family life, faith, and personal growth. Together, we'll discuss the pros and cons of starting a family early, how it fits into a larger picture of masculinity, and how to approach this decision in a way that's aligned with your personal values and goals as a man. So let's get into it and explore the real conversation about starting a family young. So Matthew, thank you for joining me today on another episode. I want to start by talking about the responsibility of fatherhood and marriage and understanding what that commitment means. So what do you think it means to be a father and a husband starting at that young age?
I think being a father and a husband starting from a young age is the same as any age, right? I think mostly what comes with being young and getting married or starting a family is the way that those two life decisions affect your personal life. So whether that's your professional goals, personal goals, whatever it may be, usually those commitments often really shape and mix up all of your commitments that you have. And so I feel like life does change when you become married at a young age or you become a father at a young age. But for the most part, it doesn't change much than if you were to do it when you were older.
I feel like that's talking to people who are honestly our age or even older than us that have decided to wait. That is kind of the main reason is, I want to wait until I can accomplish X, or I want to establish myself first. I want to do something, and I'm obviously in the same boat as all of those people, having not had kids yet. I've talked to people who are in their late 30s, early 40s, who have just now started a family and have encouraged me and my wife to wait till we're in our 30s to start so that we can accomplish whatever it is that they decided they wanted to accomplish before they had kids. And as you kind of mentioned, it doesn't really matter whether you do it young or old. And that's a lot of the advice I've gotten from people who have done both is I think the biggest concern is probably financial responsibility or your financial position. And everyone I've talked to says it doesn't really matter how set up you are. Once you have kids, you're going to be broke anyway. So I feel like that could probably be applied to a greater principle. If it doesn't really matter how much you've tried to do X before, once you have kids, it's the reset. It doesn't matter what you're trying to do, what you are trying to accomplish, what you're trying to grow, whatever that is you're searching for before having kids at any age. When that responsibility hits you, it's still gonna affect you the same way. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also make the argument that from these two big life commitments, right, getting married and having kids, that I think really only one of those commitments you have to give a lot of thought into. And you might disagree with this, but I think the biggest commitment out of those two is actually marriage. In terms of when you decide to get married, then you decide to have another person in your life. You decide to become one, and you start this journey of learning how to sacrifice personal gain for another person. And then I think the decision to have children actually come from that first commitment. So when you get married, obviously a command from God, but also just something that's really good is to start having kids. And so when you have them, of course, is completely up to you. But I do think it's something that if you're a man listening to this, maybe a single man, I think weighing the decision of marriage more than weighing the decision of having kids can be very beneficial.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You're right, because I don't think either decisions are necessarily a two-way street where you can decide to revert. I think you and I have a very similar view of marriage, where it is a lifetime commitment to a person. You are bonding yourselves with them to become one. In a similar way, you kind of can't just back out of having kids, at least not in a responsible manner.
Yeah.
So both decisions are very much unidirectional, but you're right. I think that kids does stem from the greater concept of getting married. So I feel like especially as young men who are not married or not in any serious relationship, there is a need to develop yourself more. There is a need for a person in your life to ground you in whatever way you need to be grounded, to help you develop in ways that you're not aware of. And that very much comes from the role of having that partner in your life who can help you see things that you can't see, show you your blind spots, and is that soft influence on your life, if you will, to help guide you in your decision making and your masculinity, honestly. And that development, which would be that step getting into a serious relationship and marriage, is fundamentally probably going to change you the most from adolescence into adulthood. And I don't know, obviously not having children, everyone says that your life will never change more once you have kids, because you're never going to look at something and realize that you could have loved it so much. That's what my mom told me when she was very much encouraging me to have kids. She just wants grandbabies, so maybe that was selfish, but she said that's how she felt. She didn't know it was possible, and it really changed her entire perspective. But from a perspective, I'd be curious on your thoughts on this, from a perspective clearly on developmental growth, starting from an adolescent-minded young man, not having been in the sort of relationship like marriage that requires sheer sacrifice and giving yourself up for somebody and changing yourselves through rapid maturity. Where do you think the most potential for that growth is? Do you think it's in that initial stage of marriage, or do you think it's post-marriage right at fatherhood?
I would say that the stage where you should be focusing on personal and professional growth the most is actually in your singleness. So I think before you get married, I do think there is something to be said. You get married, you have a wife, but you don't have kids yet. And so you're going to focus on your professional growth until you have kids, until that happens. And then, of course, like you said, once your kids leave the house or once they get older, what does that look like? I just think if you look at that stage, it just gets more tricky, right? You have teenagers, they might leave the house, but you still have a responsibility to your children, even if they're in college or they become adults, especially when they start having kids, right? And you become a grandfather or a grandmother. So I really do think the one stage that men should be looking to really pour into their professional growth should be in their singleness. That is the one time where you don't have commitments to a wife, don't have commitments to children. I think biblically too, you see that singleness is actually coveted. Singleness is very important. It's a very important time for you to grow spiritually, physically, mentally. And so yeah, if you're single and you're thinking about getting married and having children, of course, those are big decisions. But I think focusing on the time period that you're in of being single and taking advantage of that, that's the best window to really work on your growth.
So I think you and I are both in agreement that kids should absolutely come after marriage, in a planned sense. So kids should come from a nuclear family style, man, wife, healthy household. And that's a whole nother topic of conversation about what does a healthy family look like. And there's been a lot of literature coming out now showing that, controversially, that nuclear family, to all of its flaws, is the most proven and healthy family for a child to develop in.
Yeah.
So that being said, children come after marriage. How would you navigate then singleness and that time for growth that you were talking about with the subjugation of responsibility that comes from being in a serious relationship where you are arguably going to see a lot of interpersonal growth? Maybe not physically. You're not having the time, obviously, to dedicate your life to fitness, or financially, where you're not able to only pursue your own career for your self-growth, right? I think there's a lot of development to come out of getting into a relationship early. So how do you balance, and this may be a little bit off topic about having kids, but I think it's crucial we dive into this because it does play a grander role in your developmental state of how to prepare yourself for these sort of situations and these sort of life changes. When you're young and you're working on these things, how do you frame that in the grander scale of, well, I still want to find a partner, knowing that that stage in your life is what you are seeking, but also where you're going to see a lot of growth versus waiting to subjugate yourself to that responsibility for the sole purpose of self-growth in singleness. So there's a balance, because you and I both got married fairly young.
Yeah.
And I am a proponent of getting married young in a healthy way.
Yeah.
If you're looking for the perfect somebody, you'll probably look forever. But being able to learn how to give yourself up and to make the sacrifices necessary to keep a relationship not just functioning, but flourishing, which I think is something that no one's really mastered. There's a lot of growth exists in that developmental stage. So how do you balance that with the youthful pursuit in singleness?
Oh, man. It's so hard. I'm also a terrible example, like you said. I got married when I was 20 years old. But I think for me, getting married at 20, I was still in college. Even though I was still somewhat able to focus on my professional growth, continue my classes, work, marriage definitely made it a lot harder. And so my wife and I talk about this all the time. We don't regret getting married early, but I do think we really recognize that we made life a whole lot more complicated for ourselves in those years that we got married, and we were going to college and working a lot to pay for a small apartment. I think it's hard as men. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on this podcast, but I was horny. I needed to get married, right? I was with a significant other. And as men, it's true. There is that longing for a significant other, longing for sex and relationship. And so I think oftentimes in this culture, you see men who want to pursue their professional growth, but also still want to pursue sex and relationships, but not give over to the commitment yet. And that's the hardest thing about being a Christian, right? Is that we're called to give over to the commitment of marriage, especially, with the desires for intimacy and physical relations. If you're a single man, trying to weigh, like, should I get diving into relationships or should I focus on what I'm doing? It can be really difficult. I do think if you're able to make that sacrifice of saying, hey, I'm either going to fully focus on my professional growth, and then when I do have a serious relationship, then I'm committed to that and I'm really focused on that. I think that's a really noble thing to do. But until you have a serious relationship, until you are really thinking about marriage, I think focusing on your professional growth is probably the more important priority out of those.
So would I be correct in saying that if you are in a stage where you are not in a serious relationship and you have the availability to work on yourself, maybe not in the sense of I'm going to pursue every hedonic pleasure I have and succumb to my desires, but in the sense that I'm working on the things that I know I need to work on to get me in the direction I know that I need to be a man, to get me to the life that I want to live as a husband, as a father, whatever that looks like. And you're able to commit to those in a much more time-consuming sense compared to if you had those other commitments such as marriage or children. To do that as long as you are not seeking the pleasure in both. Kind of like what you were talking about. I was thinking double dipping is I want to live in singleness so I can pursue my finances, or I can pursue my career growth selfishly, while also being able to do these acts that are going to please my pleasure seeking that I would get out of a relationship where I want to have the sex, but I also want to be single so I can go and pursue all of these things that I want to pursue, right? Very I-centered focused, and you're kind of double dipping. I feel like what you're getting at is as long as you're not living in that state where if you're actively pursuing things in singleness to make yourself better, waiting for that relationship to come so you can commit yourself to it, then it could be a healthy way of pursuing growth. Whereas if you're double dipping in that sense, or you're trying to take what is supposed to be good away from marriage and using it selfishly, such as seeking the sexual pleasure, then you're either not ready or you need to make up your mind on where you want to go in life.
I agree with that. I think an important thing to evaluate in your life especially as a single man is, am I working at my professional growth for the hedonism benefits, right? Pursuing pleasure, the things that our culture tells us, or am I pursuing wealth and professional development so that I'm set up better in the future for my family? Maybe it's to be more generous, to take care of people better. And so that's an important question. I think oftentimes young men are in that hedonist category where they pursue professional development and wealth because they really want to enjoy the pleasures that come with that. But if you're a single man and you're able to focus on your spiritual growth and professional growth to build wealth for your family in the future, build wealth to be generous, to give to God, whatever it may be, I think that's a really good thing. I think it's a really good time of your life to be focusing on those things.
So let's tie this back into fatherhood. We talked about singleness leading into relationship and the jump of responsibility that's required to take in order to move to that next stage in life. What would be that next step then into fatherhood? And maybe you can speak from personal experience, having chosen to get married at such a young age, and mention that you were able to still pursue your career growth and education, but getting married young added that extra level of complexity and responsibility to it. How did that compare then to the decision or the act of having children and that jump in responsibility? Was that comparable to your personal experience getting married young and being in a situation where you, one, were still able to pursue your professional career, but also you had to for the obligation to provide for your marriage now? Compare that to the jump to fatherhood.
Man, I think there's something to be said. When we got married, we wanted to make sure that we finished school before we started having a family, before we started having kids and trying for kids. But I do think there's also something to be said that if there's not a huge barrier to you starting a family, to just kind of allow the timing to work itself out, right? Like you're married, maybe you're not in school anymore, you're working full time. And so now just kind of let the family building happen. Some people are super fertile and, can get pregnant right away. And then some people, it takes a long time. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of trying. And so I guess I would say I'm in the argument of, as long as there's not a huge barrier in your life that would make having kids super difficult, like finishing college, to just kind of let it happen. If God wants you to have children, then just let him give you children. I don't know. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
No one knows this, but Matthew just winked at me because we've had this conversation a dozen times. He's pushing me to have kids. It does. It definitely does. Would you agree that the greatest jump in responsibility as a young man who, if your starting point is you're undeveloped in your maturity and growth, or you have multiple pillars of life, right, of living what balanced masculinity is. If you're undeveloped in adolescence, jumping from that to the requirement of maturity and responsibility in marriage is a bigger jump than once you're at that point in marriage and you have developed the maturity to live a healthy marriage. That jump into fatherhood is lesser.
I would agree. I think, okay, maybe a little controversial, but I think marriage is more important than having kids in terms of your growth. So I think one thing I found out from becoming a father when we had our first child, it really exposed how poor our relationship and marriage was between my wife and I. Marriage is always your first commitment, is always your first covenant, right? And of course, kids stem from that. But really, to raise a healthy family, you have to have a healthy marriage first. And you have to be working at your marriage even above your children sometimes, right? Because children, no matter what, when you have a baby, they're going to demand so much attention, so much time. But the weird thing about marriage and a spouse is it's easy to put off your relationship, to put off giving each other attention for a long time in order to care for an infant. And I think you'll find that as you have children, you learn even more how important marriage is. So I always tell people, my wife has been saying that she wants to try for a third kid. And I keep telling people, like, I'm not ready yet. I want my wife back. And there's a definite reality to that when you have children, especially for the mother, right? You know, you have a child on you at all times. It's really hard then to give attention to your husband and vice versa. And so there is something to be said too, that as you're having kids, that you should be working on your marriage first and foremost, because that's a really hard relationship to keep going when you have children.
I'd be curious your thoughts on this. I know through conversations with my wife about this is something we're really going to struggle with because, as you know, my wife really loves babies. And I know she's going to be a great mom, but she is going to give everything to that child. Mm-hmm. And it's very common to say, once you have a child, they're the most important thing in your life now.
Yeah.
Obviously, as a parent, you would sacrifice yourself for your child, but I feel like you would also sacrifice your spouse for your child as well, because you've created this thing. Like you said, it's kind of controversial to say, but we're called to love our spouse first. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be really difficult. I know we're definitely going to struggle with that. I'd be curious if that's something that you struggled with when you first started having kids. Is did you or were you able to prioritize loving your spouse on top of a child? Because I feel like that's countercultural. Mm-hmm. You want to give everything to this child above all else. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of marital complications, as you were alluding to, including divorces. Divorce rates are at an all-time high. And I feel like it's because we're pouring so much into our children. Mm-hmm. We're not able to pour anything into our relationships. And when you're raising a kid together, at a certain point, the foundation of what raising a kid should be, which is the relationship that the marriage is built on, crumbles into nothing, and then it just explodes. And that's why divorce rates are at an all-time high.
Yeah.
Is that something that you struggled with?
I definitely struggled with it. I do think it's different for fathers and mothers, right? Mothers go through painful childbearing. Their bodies change physically a lot. I think mentally too, right? That mothers are just so attached to their children when they're born, infants, 24/7, you know, holding this child. The father can help out here and there, but ultimately the mother is putting so much time. So I think for my wife, when we started having kids, her temptation was to give more attention to the child than to her husband. For me as a husband, the temptation was to be really angry with my wife, which was really terrible. I really felt like I was in a season of like man, why doesn't my wife care about me? Because she's caring for a child above me. But one thing I'll never forget that I really believe in is that the best thing you can give your children is a healthy marriage, right? So especially as those kids get older, as they start to pick up words and start to really evaluate, kids really pick up on your relationship with your wife. Seeing an example of a healthy marriage will not only set them up for success in their future marriage, but I think also really set them up for success spiritually, with their relationship with God, which is really important, because in the Bible, the greatest metaphor for our covenant with Christ is a marriage, just like the marriage that we have here.
I think Tim Keller sums it up really well, talking about how you can create that sort of relationship. He says in his marriage devotional is that you can't fake being a good husband or a good spouse. If you, in that moment, don't have any love to give and you really have to fake it, and you're like, man, that really ticked me off. I'm really upset about this. This is a stupid thing to be upset about, but I am. I really don't want to show you any love or grace right now, but you do. You're not faking it. Even though you may have to force it, it feels like you are faking being a loving partner, being a loving spouse, being a loving father, and showing that love to your wife. Even though you're faking it, you're not faking it, because if you are doing the thing, it's not faking it. You're actually just doing the thing. So if you have to fake loving your spouse in that moment, you are actually loving your spouse in that moment, even if it doesn't feel that way internally. And that's something that children are really going to pick up on, as he says, is you are then cultivating that environment where you are, especially to your children, always showing that love to your partner.
Yeah.
So I want to know if you think, and you kind of already touched on this, but I feel like this is in a lot of people's minds who are in a relationship or who have entered marriage or who want to enter marriage, because I know a lot of people who are young-ish, who are not married, who are looking to get married with the anticipation of starting a family.
Yeah.
Is there ever a perfect time to start a family? Or is it something where you just kind of have to take the leap?
I don't think there's ever a perfect time to start a family. I think it's specific to where you're at in your relationship, especially in your marriage. Like we talked about, are there any big barriers that would make having kids really difficult or really straining? But yeah, I don't think there's a perfect timing. I think God kind of knows the perfect timing for you to have children. That's why I argue to just let it happen, right? I think some people will argue that, like, just let it happen. If God thinks that it's a terrible time for you to have children right now, he might hold off a little bit. But I do think God really uses children to grow us, especially when you become a father. He uses children to help grow your marriage, and expose where you're weak at in your marriage. And he also uses children to help your own spiritual walk with him, and then also to disciple these children that you are raising. And so I would argue that to God, there's no like desired time to have children. Like once you're married, I think God, for the most part, is probably rooting for you to have kids. Once you're in that covenant, God wants you to bear children. There might be certain circumstances where he might hold off, or maybe it is a good idea to hold off. But I don't think there's a perfect time to start a family.
So let's say you start a family. How does becoming that father then impact your career development and personal goals, having this new formed responsibility in your life that you have to live up to?
Of course, becoming a father affects your physical health. It affects your sleep. You might put off workouts and eating healthy for a time because you're just so focused on caring for your wife and children. So that can definitely affect your professional growth. I think too, your priorities shift, right? So maybe before having kids, if you were in a marriage, your priorities were probably wife and then job. Then when you throw children in the mix, your priorities are probably wife, children, job, right? So it gets bumped down. And it still doesn't mean that it's not important. But I think maybe those nights where you're like, oh, I'm going to put in some extra work at my job. You might not have that opportunity anymore. You might say, oh, I have to help take care of the kids. And so that can really affect a lot. I think there are men who are really successful in their professional growth, even with kids, and they find a way to make it work. Maybe they're just getting even less sleep. So they have their commitment to wife, children, and then whatever energy they have left, they're throwing at their professional job and staying up extra late to work on things. That's a tough road to take, but I do think it's admirable sometimes too, depending on where you're at in your professional growth.
How would you navigate as a young man who is in their profession, who's probably not where they want to be, right? If you're young in your profession, you're probably not starting at the top of the food chain. There is somewhere you want to be. There's somewhere you want to climb to.
Yeah.
And that's probably not something that ever changes, but especially when you're younger and you have a lot of that ambition and there's a lot more road in front of you to climb, knowing that, hey, if I get to this next step, if I get to this next stage, right now I'm here, I'm in the weeds, I'm towards the bottom of the totem pole, but if I can get up to this next step or 2 steps ahead of where I am now, that will grant me the ability. I'll be managing my own schedule, or I'll be in a position where I am better suited to raise a family or have kids, but then also knowing that that might be several years away too.
Yeah.
So there's a balance between, well, I know that if I'm here, wherever here is, on paper, I will have more ability to give to my family, but that means I won't be able to start that until I can hit that goal. And that's not always a defined amount of time.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's the same thing where at the beginning we were talking about the level of responsibility and readiness? It doesn't matter where you are at in your life, it's still going to reset you in a manner that it's going to take it all out of you regardless, or where taking that step doesn't matter where you are in your career, it's still going to have the same effect on you? Or do you feel like there is some utility in getting to a position where you are better suited?
Yeah, I think the biblical financial responsibility that I see of a husband and a father is not necessarily to make a certain amount of money. But what it is that wherever you're at when you start having kids is to find a way to provide. And so we talked about this earlier. If you're working a minimum wage job, I guarantee you can make it work. It might be really hard, right? You might have to put in extra hours or pick up some extra work. But you can absolutely have children and still make it work with a minimum wage job. There's something to be said for, hey, I don't want to be working 60 hours a week to provide for my family. I want to be home more. When we start having kids, I want my kids to have a house, right? I want to be able to plant some roots. There's something to be said for that and working towards that. But I do think, again, going back to no perfect timing to have children, I think whenever you do have kids, the call as a husband and as a father then is just to find a way to make it work. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question. I think you kind of knew already where I stood on that.
I did. I was curious on your thoughts though. And unfortunately, like a lot of expectations of men today, when their duty is to provide, is you just kind of have to make it work. And I think that's a lot of mindset of men too, is that there is a sort of embellished stoicism in, no matter what, I will make this work. So with that, do you think there's any specific practical steps that young men could take to prepare financially for a family?
Yeah, I think the practical steps is focusing in your singleness, like we talked about. So when you're single, focusing on your professional growth and building a little bit of wealth. And then I think most of the practical steps you can take is just being smarter with money, right? So you see that when you have a family, when there is a financial burden of children or a home or whatever it is, the greatest thing you can do is just be smarter, be a little bit more frugal, which is hard to do in our day and age, especially when you do start having kids, right? You want to buy them the nice clothes, the new toys, all these things. But also, there's something to be said, like, for the first few years of a child's life, they're not going to remember the toys and clothes that you bought them, you know? So, instead of buying a new Nike jumpsuit onesie, like just go get a generic jumpsuit onesie kind of thing. The most practical thing you can do right now is start thinking about how to be smarter with your money when you do have kids, how to be more responsible. What are your priorities with money? So if you have children in a home, right, those are your top 2 priorities, and then it goes to other things.
So there is something to be said about if you are not fiscally responsible, that is a key developmental skill that you need to work on in order to ensure some level of, I don't want to say success, but just baseline survivability of preparing or of providing for your family, is making sure that you are on top of shepherding your finances, and that maybe that's not your role. Maybe that's your partner's role. Maybe they're better suited at those sort of things, but making sure that that is being shepherded in a way that could healthily prepare, or at least is not, at the very least, detrimental to raising a family. Yeah. So finances definitely play a big key in preparing yourself, making sure that you are ready. And that doesn't mean hitting a certain dollar value in the bank account. I don't think that will ever work. I think that's a lot of people's hesitations for getting married and for having kids is, I need to hit this empirical milestone. But having the skills to make sure that you are financially responsible is a key trait of success in raising a family. Yeah. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's good. That's really good. I think what you said there of being financially responsible and working on that right now, even if you're single. So maybe you're evaluating things in your life like expenditures. Am I going to be able to keep this expenditure when I'm married and when I have children? So if you're going out to eat every single day, most likely when you get married and start having kids, you're not going to be going out to eat every single day. And so recognizing that as a practical way you can start practicing right now. You're like, okay, I recognize this is a benefit of being single, or this is a benefit of not having kids in a marriage. Let's start, slowly working at it, slowly working towards being a little bit more frugal here.
So we talked a lot about the developments that you can make as a man to prepare yourself, both in singleness and in marriage or in a relationship, to make sure that you are, when the time comes to have kids, ready. But what about the benefits to actually just having kids young? I think it's fair to say that becoming a father at a young age will definitely push you to maturity faster.
Yeah.
And it will give you the developmental resilience to take on more responsibility. And I'm sure then there's more joy in being present in your children's milestones. As younger, you're able to be more present, be more physical with kids. What about some long-term benefits of having children early? Both your kids are fairly young right now. Have you seen any sort of benefits already at being a young father, or do you foresee more coming down the road, having started earlier in life?
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on the joy thing. So of course, joy is already a huge benefit no matter what age you have kids, right? They just bring so much joy to your life. I think also too, having children younger, for example, I'm 27. I already have some back issues, right? Just from holding kids. I could not imagine how much worse it would be if I was 35, 36, 10 years older. So there's something to be said too, like the physical exertion that it takes to hold babies, run with kids, play with kids. It definitely is a pro if you're young and your body is doing well. I always think back to the Bible where they say that kids are like arrows that you store in your quiver, right? And so essentially saying that there are these things that are just really good, and like it's good to have kids and store up as many children and relationships that you can. I know people don't want to hear that because there's definitely people who are like, oh, I want to have 5, 6 kids. And then there's people who are like, oh, I'm good with 1. But I do think there's something to be said of recognizing the goodness of having children, and that it's a gift from God really at an early age. Really just sheds a light on who God is And that's always beneficial to learn that as early as possible.
So do you see any long-term benefits of having kids besides the lack of potential back problems in the future?
Yeah, I do think so. I think, okay, so we had our first child when I was 24. So let's say my daughter grows up, she's 18, she goes off to college. I would be, 42? So I'd be 42 years old, and we talked about like the importance of marriage too. I think there's some benefit to having your children become adults when you're younger. Then you, again, regain a little bit more energy to throw into your marriage or to throw into spending time with your wife, whatever it may be. Of course, here in America, the common thing is, once your kids are out of the house, it's time to travel, baby. So, I do think there's some benefits there of having kids young. Like, you can then travel and be in better health. You don't have to be 65 and, can barely walk.
Geriatric traveling the world.
Exactly. So I do think there's benefits there. I do think then also looking down the road, and my kids have kids and I become a grandfather, I can be a better grandfather even down the road because I'll have more years with my grandchildren.
I think that is probably something that's so far down the road for most people, they're not going to really think about it. But being a young grandparent is kind of appealing, right? Imagine being able to not just be present and healthy with your kids, or grandkids, but actually being able to be physical with them and run around with them and do things. Mm-hmm. Because one set of my grandparents was much older. They passed away when I was a young teenager, mm-hmm. in their 90s. So they were very much, they sat on chairs and they played cards, and that was kind of it. There was no activity with them. They were great and they were present, but there was no actual physical engagement between me and them because they were so much older.
Yeah.
My other set of grandparents were much younger, but were not in the healthiest of positions to be able to play and be, again, physically present, much more so than the other set who were substantially older, but still they were able to physically be present, but they weren't able to be physical, mm-hmm. if that makes sense. So there's two parts of that is you need to just inherently be young in order to be healthier. Yeah. Makes more sense. But also you need to be healthier, and you need to make sure that you are living a life that's not going to deteriorate your body. So when you get to that age, you are unable to be present. So I do feel like being a young grandparent is probably not something that most people think about, mm-hmm. but I can only see upsides assuming that you're not a really young grandparent, right?
Yeah.
And that all stems from being a young parent or pursuing children at a younger age. That's still appropriate if it's a choice.
Yeah.
So what does the Bible say about starting a family, and how does that shape our decision to marry and have children young? I know we kind of talked about this a little bit, about how we are called to, or about how the Bible uses marriage as the epitome of what a relationship and what a relationship with like Christ would be, mm-hmm. and how that unity of marriage, 3 in 1, is probably the greatest way that you can grow in your relationship with God and also become intertwined with this person.
Yeah.
But then also we're called to be fruitful and multiply and have children if we are able. Besides that, or maybe expounding upon that, what do you know of how the Bible defines what marriage and children look like as a healthy Christian male?
So I think starting off with marriage, right? You get married, you have a wife. God has given you a partner to walk through the tough parts of living here on this earth, right? First and foremost. He's also given you a partner to disciple, right? So vice versa. The husband is there to disciple his wife, and the wife is there to help disciple her husband. So already that's a very important relationship that Jesus is teaching us. How to disciple one another, how to disciple another person that, you're just walking through the moments and seasons of life. And then when it comes to children, you start having children, you essentially have a small church in your house, right? You're raising kids, you have a wife. Your job then is also to disciple your children and to be a good example for them, to lead them in the way that they should go, right? That's a common phrase from the Bible, that as they become adults, that you have given them a strong foundation. I think too, one thing that's really important is habits for children. Habits are super important for children to have, good habits, whether that's chores, whether it's times of prayer, right? So even just praying before a meal, having a dinner at the table as a family, that's a really big one. Some people grow up without having dinner as a family at the table. So having children is an opportunity to teach the next generation what it's like to be a Christ follower, what it's like to be a good Christian, what it's like to be a father, what it's like to be a husband. Young child who's being raised, they're watching how you are being a father to them. They're watching how you're being a husband to your wife. And then they're also watching you to, like, what does it mean to be Christ-like? What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to follow Christ and have a relationship with him? And so those are all huge things. I do think there is an aspect of you can be a great influence and example for your children, and ultimately your children still have to decide for themselves when they're an adult to follow Christ and have a relationship with him. But I don't think we should ever downplay the importance of laying a firm foundation, teaching them really healthy habits, and then how to love God and how to love others.
Did your faith play a role in your decision to have kids young?
Honestly, probably not a very large role. I think I've learned a lot of these things from having kids, right? So I don't think I was super stoked to start a small church in my household by having kids. Like, I don't think that was my first thought. But it's more one of those things where you have children and then God reveals the importance of these things to you. And so definitely not my number one motivation for having children.
I feel like I'm in the same boat at this point. Beyond the call to have children and to honor God in that way, I want children because my wife has programmed me over the years to want children. So we kind of touched on how the foundation of the family is built on marriage before children. I'd be curious on your views on balancing marriage and parenthood and why one should be considered before the other. We talked about how difficult that can be and how we're called to, and how it's something that I know I'm going to struggle with. It's something that you've struggled with. Do you have any insights that could help people who have struggled with that or are currently struggling with that or are in my boat where they know that's going to be a battle?
Mm-hmm. Oh man, I think my advice coming from somebody who's battling with this right now, of course, having children is just something that's really hard. Like, I don't know how single parents do it. It is super hard. Like that saying of like, it takes a village to raise a child. There's some truth that like, it's even too hard for just a husband and wife. Like, you need grandparents, you need church community, close friends to help you in times. Like, there might be a week where you're like, you know, I need an hour break. I need to be able to just go be with my husband or wife, or go even be by myself. And so I need somebody else to help me. And so I think recognizing that as husband and wife, that you can encourage one another and actually grow your relationship with one another by just going through the mud with them, right? The toughness of having children, and recognizing it as a time to build your relationship with one another. If we have a new infant and that infant is waking up 3 or 4 times a night to eat, right? Like, that sucks. You're not going to get very much sleep. But I think then what follows from that is encouraging your wives encouraging your husbands. Hey, let's keep at it. How can I help you? I think that piece of trying to show up one another in love, especially while having a child, that's like one of the most important things you can do. You're both tired. You're both depleted. I think wives definitely take on more of the physical tiredness than the husbands do, but the husbands take on some of the mental tiredness of thinking about, providing for their family, encouraging one another in that, doing little acts of love and kindness for one another, even when it's hard, making coffee for your spouse when they didn't get a good night's rest. That's a big thing. And then also too, don't downplay the importance of date nights. and the importance of dropping off your kids with somebody that you trust. I think one thing we found, my wife and I, is when we first started having kids, we didn't have a very large support circle of whether it's grandparents or even close friends to drop off our kids to, so that we could go have a date night. And now we're realizing the importance of that, of building this circle around you, this small village that can step in and say, hey, I'll watch your kids for an hour or 2 hours so you guys can go hang out, go get a meal, go to a movie. That's super important. And that's something we are still trying to learn how to do. We're still really bad at it. We're really bad at trusting other people with our children. Really bad at just even initiating it and seeing it as something that's really important.
Do you think that as something that you're currently working on is making sure that relationship, that bond between husband and wife is healthy and where it should be in terms of your prioritization as a man and your responsibility in your relationships? As someone who's struggling with that, or I think as all men will struggle with that, did that affect or will that affect your thoughts or your timeline on having a third child?
It definitely does affect. And it's one of those things that you don't really necessarily fully grasp until you have your first child. So it's hard to think about these things before you have your first child. But I think after having your first child, you recognize some of these patterns and recognize where you need to put more effort into your marriage and your relationship with your spouse. And so, yeah, like I shared, as we talk about having a third child, I've shared with my wife, like, I really feel called, like, we should be working on this a lot better before we have a third child. And again, we're kind of in the space where we're not like completely preventing it, but we would love to see our relationship with one another grow so that as we introduce another child to our family, as our other two children get older, that they would see a healthy marriage between my wife and I.
So there definitely is a utility in making sure that your marriage is healthy before bringing at least more children.
Yeah.
Because it's something that's going to happen after your first child.
Yeah.
And without, I think, kicking the can too far down the road, there's definitely utility in ensuring that your marriage is optimally oriented towards the direction it should be pointed before bringing in more children into that household.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's true. And of course, you can work on those things before you start having kids. I think it's just harder to understand the depth of what you need to work on relationally in regards to those things I mentioned until you do have children. But there is something to be said, like, you're married, you don't have kids yet. Hey man, pour into your marriage. Go have date nights. Get to know your spouse better. Get to know what little acts of love and kindness you can do to encourage them on the daily. Get to know what kind of person they are with no sleep. That's an important one, right? Like, you might be really thrown off when you start having kids and you have a spouse who's usually really like to the T. Oh, I get my 8 hours or whatever it is. And then suddenly they're only getting 4 and they might change as a person. So I think even learning those things without having children is really important. Learning how your partner operates and where they need to be encouraged.
So basically what we've learned is there is a degree that you need to develop yourself as a man before having kids and jumping into these responsibilities. But you also kind of just have to jump into the deep end and figure it out.
Yeah.
Which is probably the answer that no one wanted, because it's completely subjective to the individual and the relationship that they're catering to.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some fears and doubts about jumping into that unknown. How do you think young men can overcome the fear of starting a family when there really isn't any sort of manual or playbook for parenthood? There's thousands of parenting books out there. Mm-hmm. And every person I've talked to that's read one either says, I read this one book and it's phenomenal, or I've read these dozen books and they're all terrible and don't listen to any of them. There's no one-size-fits-all policy. Do you find utility in parenting books, or do you think that you kind of just have to figure it out on your own and that there isn't a manual for parenthood?
Of course, knowledge is important, so reading is important. Again, going to people who have raised children well, taking advice from them, that's always really important. I think I do kind of fall on the side of you learn most from just diving in. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Colton, as somebody who doesn't have kids yet, but is kind of in the space of might be getting close. We don't exactly know yet. Maybe holding off a little longer.
Don't give my wife any hopes if she listens to this.
But how would you say you would overcome that fear of wanting to start?
Unfortunately, my answer is highly personal because I'm somebody who, if I want to take on a project or do something, I will research, I don't want to say the bare minimum, but I will research enough to have a grasp, and then I'll say, I can do that. And then I jump in and I do it. That's every project I've ever worked on around the house or working on cars or bikes or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. I will vaguely get an understanding of things that I don't understand with a quick Google search.
Yeah.
And then I will use my intuition to kind of guide me the rest of the way. So I feel like with parenthood, I would seek out advice and wisdom from sources to a degree, but then also be like, in my arrogance, oh, everybody has kids.
Yeah.
I, of course, can have kids, and I'll be great at it, and I don't need to do all this research. But I think there's a balance, because you could become over research oriented and read every parenting and baby book on the planet, and I don't know if that's necessarily healthy either.
Yeah.
You could spend your whole life researching how to be the best parent in the world and then never end up having time to become a parent. Or your kid requires you to raise them in a way that, well, it's specific to them in your household. It's never going to be anything beyond generic parenting advice. Like, yeah, you probably shouldn't smoke in front of your kids, is going to only ever be partially applied to how you raise kids. So I don't know. I feel like it's hard to say. We're not trying for kids and we're not pregnant or have kids, but I don't know what I'm going to be like yet.
Okay.
If we get pregnant tomorrow, I might panic and order 1,000 parenting books, or I might just go with the flow. We'll see, I guess.
Glad to hear it. So that means that you haven't dove into parenting books or knowledge yet?
Not specifically. I think, as you know, we've definitely put ourselves in situations where we're around families and we're trying to orient ourselves towards what a healthy family, a healthy household looks like, and seeking out mentors and people that we can emulate in that way.
Yeah. So
we're actively trying to be around that lifestyle. One, that's just kind of the people that we're friends with, like such as yourself, just happen to have kids. But then also, two, we are selfishly, actively looking to see what that looks like, just to prepare ourselves as well.
Yeah.
More so my wife trying to push me to be around babies and children all the time, hoping that I also get baby fever. But
yeah,
there's definitely there's two sides to it, but I think real life examples work the best. It is weird. There's a strong biological and hormonal difference between men and women in terms of what being around children does. Because I know a lot of young women who want nothing to do with kids. They're just not ready. They want to wait, or they don't have, that's not a goal they have in life.
Yeah.
But they're also not around kids ever. I feel like and this is very limited, but every woman I've met that is around babies who doesn't have children or is around children constantly, it's something about that rewires them to have baby fever and really want kids. Or maybe it's the complete opposite, and they realize that how snotty they are and they want nothing to do with them. But typically it's being around that physical exposure does something to you that makes you want that more. Whereas For men, I don't know if that's always the case. At least it's not as it's not as rapidly onset as it is for women, just from my own observations. But I think being around that in a healthy manner is certainly, at least from my own experience, enticing. There is something about that you can see, oh, yeah, dirty diapers are gross, but still children are a blessing, and there's something that should be honored and sought as such.
Yeah. I will say that it is easier to change your own child's poop than it is to change somebody else's. I don't know if God did something there with our smelling genes, but I don't know. It doesn't smell as bad when it's your own child. It does still smell bad, but it makes it a lot easier when it's your own kid.
You can only blame yourself.
Yeah, right. Probably smells like yours.
Oh, man. I hope to never experience that.
Do you think, Colton, that a lot of the fear, especially for men, around having children, starting a family, does it mostly come from our culture or like our materialistic mindset, or do you think it comes from other places? Like, do you think it's just a natural fear that men have?
I don't know. There's definitely two parts to that. Biologically, men are not on the same clock that women are on. So I think it's easier to push that responsibility and that clear delineation of being able to do what you desire versus what is required of you as a man. Mm-hmm. So if you're not in a committed relationship with somebody who is on a biological clock to have children, it's easier to kick the can down the road. But there also is, especially as men, in today's world, it is not as easy for a man to solely provide for a family. Mm-hmm. But I think there is something deeper than just the 1950s subjective housewife stereotype where the man should be providing that drives men to want to seek that. Yeah. I think that could be a whole conversation its own about why do men have a desire? Why does it feel more natural for them to be the ones that are able to provide? I think we're wired to protect. Mm-hmm. We're wired to serve in that manner. That includes making sure that your family is cared for. Mm. And with that comes the fiscal responsibility that you need to prepare yourself, that you need to prepare your family, that you need to make sure that it solely falls on you. Even if it doesn't, at least in my experience, it feels like it solely falls on me. If something were to happen, even if I need two incomes to provide for my family, mm-hmm. if something were to happen to my wife, it still falls on me. Yep. To make sure that we make it out okay and that we're able to provide and survive and flourish, whatever that looks like. That burden, I feel like, falls on men, and we're naturally wired to hold that burden. And so with that comes the pursuit of career growth and finances and developing wealth, maybe not necessarily as a dollar sign in the bank account, but mm-hmm. developing the wealth as a part of the foundation required to have a family someday. Yeah. And with all that being said, that definitely leads men down a different path than it would women in terms of career growth, seeking these things, being in a materialistic world where we're now exposed to everything that we could ever want, and potentially having the means to pursue that if we were to choose, especially if we do not have the responsibility of a spouse or family that would otherwise reorientate our efforts towards a different goal. There's two parts to that question where we are naturally wired, I think, to want to pursue maybe more materialistic things over a family because of how we're naturally wired to be able to provide, mm-hmm. which sounds counterintuitive if you don't have a family to provide for. But then that also puts us in the modern day world of we have all these things around us and we have the means to pursue that if we so choose. Yeah. And as a man, I feel like because of how we're biologically wired and the world we live in, it's much easier for us to choose that path. It's easy for us to not want kids young because of all that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You pointed out that like we have this biological wiring that bring up certain fears around having kids or even marriage. And then in addition to that, our world and culture builds on that with these materialistic fears that they install in you and cultural fears. And so it's like, it makes it really heavy for men. Like, I do think it's a legit thing for most men to be super afraid of providing for a family, not having enough wealth, not being successful enough. I think on the counter side, like, of course, women have their own fears, but like you mentioned, their biological wiring fears are usually in a different space. And even though culture in our materialistic world still pushes them to pursue a professional career, it is kind of like two separate fears. Where for men, it's like we get our fears just built on one another. And sometimes it feels like it's a little bit more crippling as men to want to start to have kids because of those two things combined.
Yeah, absolutely. There is, without downplaying the obvious roles that women play and their own career growth and how they obviously are at a much higher physical risk in raising children, both in their terms of the required presence, but also what that actually does to them biologically. There is certainly pressures and tolls that men undergo throughout that process that really haven't been delved into because they're not as physical. It's much more mentally tolling. It's much more mental strain. It's much more, even if it's not necessarily external, there is certainly an internal pressure, or there's some sort of burning sensation that comes from within, along with the societal pressure and the pressures from the outside in your circumstances and your environment to also meet certain expectations. That alone is enough, I think, to scare men away from wanting to have children or be in a serious relationship where that is a serious potential. And so that's much easier for them than to justify not pursuing those means and to kick that can down the road of waiting to have kids, or even convincing themselves that they don't want kids and that's not the lifestyle that they want to live.
Yeah, it's interesting. It feels like there's an appropriate amount of fear and worry that is good for men surrounding having kids, because usually fear and worry pushes you to action, right? But then what we see often within our society is a far greater amount of that fear that instead of pushing us to action, for a lot of men, it pushes us into like, I just don't want to have kids. Like, I'm not even going to do it because it's too scary or it's too much. And there's too much that you don't know.
It turns from the fuel required to motivate you to the crippling fear to even start.
Yeah.
Because you're right. I think there's a healthy balance. If you feel no responsibility starting a family, then there should be a responsibility. There should be a level of, whether that's stress or external factors or internal desires that drive you to need to provide in a certain way. And that's just that's gonna inherently come with parenthood. And if you feel none of that, then that's strange. I don't know if any man who's properly oriented would ever feel that.
Yeah.
There's always going to be the pressures of responsibility, but that should only ever drive you. And if you are getting so crippled by it till you don't even want to start, that is just detrimental to, I think, modern relationships, because we're seeing a birth decline like we've never seen. We're seeing a divorce rate like we've never seen. We're seeing a decline in national religion and orientation towards some sort of higher purpose than we've ever seen. And all of these things kind of coincide with, one, you can succumb to your own desires and do what you want in the moment. But two, I think that just compounds onto more pressures, which are going to compound into those pressures becoming crippling rather than motivating, which compounds to worsening the issue, and we're seeing the snowball effect.
Yeah. So going back to the question of the impact of starting a family on personal and professional growth, obviously you're somebody who, as an engineer, is working really hard at his job, working hard to build a portfolio of wealth in order to care for your family. as you envision in the future, no matter where it's at, a few years down the road, however close it is, as you envision having children, how do you envision your personal growth being affected?
I hope that it only increases, but I certainly, especially in the past several years, and marriage definitely fueled this, as we kind of talked to earlier, the jump from singleness or casual relationship to serious relationship and marriage definitely had the biggest increase I've seen as someone who's always kind of sought personal growth and development. Mm-hmm. I saw the biggest jump there. In the past several years, I have very much had the biggest jump and push for personal development, but a lot of that is it's personal development. It's for me. It's me taking time out of my day to work on this for myself. Mm-hmm. So I see that personal development hopefully not slowing down or stopping or reverting, but probably shifting very much into the communal. Because even working out, let's say I dedicate on average 7 to 8 hours a week minimum in the gym. There is some communal responsibility for that. I do need to be healthy. Mm-hmm. And we kind of talked on that last time we spoke about what does it mean to, and what responsibility do you actually have as a man to stay healthy. But it is also very much for me as well. I want to develop my strength or my physique, whatever that looks like. Mm-hmm. And I think that that is a core pillar of my personal development, but I see similar pillars having to adapt instead of me taking time out of my day to work on this for myself so I can make myself better. It's going to have to probably change. Maybe you can touch on that too, towards I need to work on this for my family, or rather than I need to work on this or develop this skill, it's I just need to do this for my family. I can no longer be away from home 12 to 14 hours a day, or I can no longer take the time to go pursue this investment strategy, or I can no longer pursue this skill because I want to, because that responsibility requires you to work on things that are communal and not internal. Yeah. Have you seen that in your development from having kids in terms of things that you worked on? I know you spoke on physical health.
Yeah.
And how that really had to change and how that actually took a hit for a while. Did you see a shift in your self-growth or your pursuit of development with the onset responsibility of fatherhood?
Yeah, absolutely. We alluded to it earlier. When your priorities get shifted, right, you have some of these pillars that you want to work on to personally grow you. And oftentimes, like, the excuse is, oh, all of my time was taken away to, be with my children and work. And so a father who might have had a couple of personal pillars, like let's just say it's working out, and then maybe it's like reading or something, right? Those have kind of taken the back burner in terms of time that you've put towards it. And like I said earlier, it's still possible to really focus on those things. So you mentioned putting in 7 to 8 hours in the gym every week without having kids. When you have kids, it's still possible to put in those 7 and 8 hours, but it means you're taking hours from something else. And most likely it's your sleep. And so I think for most people, it's just sometimes those pillars stay, right? So we talk about things that kind of form our identity. Like you might say, like, working out and gym culture is part of my identity right now. Or maybe it's a sport or a hobby. And sometimes becoming a father can shift your identity in those pillars a little bit. I still think it's really important to have those pieces of your identity that you're putting in hours towards. But maybe it's fewer hours. Or maybe, like for me, I know that if I want to go to the gym, the best way to do it is wake up at 4:30 in the morning and go to the gym, because it feels like that's the time of day that I have time. And so, again, going back to the responsibility of fathers and husbands, you have this responsibility to your wife and your children, but you still have that responsibility to yourself too. However, it's probably third in line, right? Because we talk about that sacrifice. And so it's still important for me, I know the best scenario for me is still wake up at 4:30 and go to the gym. I don't do it because I'm so tired a lot of the times and it's hard for me to wake up early. But I do see the importance of like, oh, I'm not meeting my own personal responsibility to myself.
So there definitely is, with the environmental shift, a required shift.
Mm-hmm.
But as a glimpse of light, I don't think anyone is going to go into fatherhood thinking that's going to make their lives easier.
Yeah.
But it certainly doesn't mean that their entire life or their growth or their developmental path
Mm-hmm.
is irreparably changed or has to be thrown out completely.
Yeah.
And that's something we talked about last time we talked about physical fitness is the change in routine does not require the entire routine to be thrown away.
Mm-hmm.
It just requires some level of reevaluation to reprioritize how that routine can still work into your benefit, to be aligned with the goals that you have established, to align with your vision of success along with your duties as a man.
Yeah. So for example, for me, before having a wife and kids, a big piece of my identity was going to play pickup basketball like every single day. And then now since having a wife and kids, it's still a part of my identity, but I only play basketball once a week. And so it might not be as big of a piece of who I am, but it's still there. And then sometimes there's other things like maybe I was in that situation, I just decided to stop playing basketball because I now have a family. And that's okay. You kind of mourn that season that you were playing pickup basketball every day, and then now you're in a season of not being able to play. And it's okay for your identity to kind of shift. Maybe your identity is shifting towards another hobby that you can do with your family, or is more family oriented, or maybe it's just building that pillar of family higher in your identity chain.
Well, Matthew, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your insights today. This has definitely been a very powerful conversation. To all the listeners out there, let's reflect on our own journeys and where we stand on this decision. Whether or not you're thinking about starting a family soon or down the road, the key is to embrace whatever your calling is with that authenticity and confidence that we're called to as men. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, share it with someone who might benefit from it. Let's keep pushing forward, stay true to your beliefs, and as always, keep chasing masculinity.